Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society, the economy, real estate, medicine, technology, and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plout. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 National American Charitable Organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission. Join our community of friends. Support this Global Connections program, and please donate. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center online, afrmc.org, via our website and social media outlets, on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and our Facebook page and discussion group. Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore important issues in our world. Today's Global Connections topic is journalism after the pandemic. Thank you to our very special guests, Professor Steve Coll, Dean, Columbia School of Journalism, columnist, The New Yorker magazine, and two-time Pulitzer Prize recipient. David Folkenflik, National Public Radio media correspondent. Mitra Kalita, co-founder and CEO of URL Media and visiting fellow at Harvard University. And Brian Stelter, chief media correspondent and anchor of Reliable Sources at CNN. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
In our monthly panels, we've been hearing about navigating the new abnormal. One recurring question of the many changes we've experienced, which will likely be recalled as passing phenomena, memories of an unusual time, and which will stick with us for better or for worse. Well, for American journalism, this was a year like none other. The pandemic forced news organizations to cover different stories in different ways, often from different locations because of the need to socially distance. And this year marked the culmination of the most hostile relationship in memory between a president and the press. Mainstream media judgments such as what's a fact and who's an expert became extremely contentious. How have the news media been changing? And is the American public being better served by those changes or worse? We have assembled, as always, a panel for whom those questions are especially important, if not matters of their everyday work lives. I'll interview them, and then, after hearing what they have to say, take questions that you can submit using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. One other thing, at the end of the hour, something completely different. We'll be hearing, as we have on many of these panels, from Dr. Michael Drescher, head of the emergency department at Rabin Medical Center, checking in on the state of COVID in Israel, not the number one news story in Israel these days, but one that we've been following in these panels throughout the past year. Now, our first guest is a remarkably accomplished journalist and journalism educator. Steve Coll won Pulitzer Prizes, both for his reporting for the Washington Post and later for his book, Ghost Wars, The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan, and Bin Laden. At the Post, he rose to be managing editor. He is now dean of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome to the panel, Steve.
Thanks, Robert. Glad to be here.
We've all been tested this past year. Did American journalism pass the tests it faced?
Largely, yes, I think so. Of course, the past year includes the end of the previous presidency, which, as you mentioned in your introduction, was an extraordinary time for journalism. I do think that the press performed its democratic function in an exemplary way throughout the Trump presidency overall, and demonstrated why it enjoys protection in our constitutional system. It functions as a kind of court of last resort for whistleblowers, for transparency, for access to the public to information about corruption, abuses of power, whether that's in government or in private business, as we've seen during the Me Too movement, when over the last few years, I think you could say that movement might not have had the oxygen it required, but for journalism, because some of the women who came forward had been failed by public courts, prosecutors, and other sections of the government that were meant to protect them. So I think it's been a time in which investigative reporting has seemed to has been more vital and more essential than ever before. Now, about the pandemic, this is prize season in journalism, and whoever has my office at Columbia reads a lot of prize entries. And one thing that's been really striking looking at the best journalism from last year is how much journalism, I think, was affected, even in its accomplishments, by the loss of access to people, being freely out on the streets, being able to knock on doors without worry. But one of the positive things that's clear in this work is that we made a huge leap forward in our profession this year in computational and data journalism, and particularly the role that news organizations like the New York Times played in collecting, aggregating, synthesizing, analyzing data about the pandemic that wasn't available from any other source, including government sources. So I think, in every crisis, there are leaps forward, leaps of change. You asked what will endure. I do think we've made a huge advance this year in computational forms of journalism that will endure for a long time.
I want you to talk about something that you've observed, which is a relationship, a vicious cycle relationship between polarization in American life, American politics, and changes in the ways in which the biggest, most successful news outlets support themselves.
Yeah, we all read the public opinion polling, so we know that views of journalism are as polarized as views about many other aspects of our political system and our political culture. And what you and I have talked about is how the changing business model of journalism since the last 10 or 20 years has reinforced this polarization that is clearly happening for other reasons as well. And by this, I mean that in the absence of advertising, which used to be the economic basis for newspaper newsrooms to thrive, news organizations have moved towards subscription strategies that require emotional engagement from their audiences in order to persuade folks to pay for journalism that they used to be able to access for free or for a quarter or a dime. And even in other fields like cable television, engagement is the new metric of successful economics. As cable companies lose subscribers and as streaming companies seek them, the sort of gold that everybody's looking for is intense engagement. And that economics is coinciding with reinforcing, I think, in some cases, political tribalization. And as we were talking about, while it marks a real change in the structure of news economics and its relationship to culture, I think, from 20 years ago, it's sort of back to the future, because this is the way news has always been organized in the United States up until, say, the Second World War: highly partisan, fractured, polarized. And of course, as you know, it's also the way news tends to be organized in other rich industrialized democracies, such as in Europe.
I wonder, is it, you mentioned the rise of computational journalism, or the advances made, and you said news organizations liked the New York Times, and I was trying to count how many news organizations there are like the New York Times. How many people can afford to engage in that kind of computational journalism that measures new COVID cases and breaks them down by county across America?
Well, it's difficult to replicate the Times' reach and scale. Its newsroom is enormous these days. But there are small entrepreneurial nonprofit startups that are doing amazing work in the same field. I think of The Markup, which is run by a very distinguished editor, a woman named Julia Angwin, who's a pioneer in computational journalism. And it's a small newsroom that has pioneered investigative reporting through computation. Why? Because today, if you want to ask how, for example, are public resources allocated, how are police forces funded across neighborhoods, the answer often lies in an algorithm that is opaque. And if you as a journalist want to say, is this algorithm doing its job? Does it have unconscious bias of some sort? Is it misallocating funds? In order to ask those questions that we used to go around City Hall asking in person, you now have to be able to reverse engineer the algorithm. And that's what Julia's team does around sort of public interest investigative reporting. And it's necessary because of the changes in the structure of information. Mm-hmm. For journalists to do their job, they need to be able to work with very complex structures of data and increasingly algorithmic decision-making.
Well, Dean Steve Coll, Professor Steve Coll of the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, thanks so much. Stick with us, please, for the Q&A. But we're now going to turn to our next panelist. And in doing so, we're going to really zoom in to journalism, not just on a local level, but on a community level. Mitra Kalita, after graduating from the very same Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, has worked at many jobs in journalism, including but not limited to reporting for the Wall Street Journal, being managing editor for editorial strategy at the Los Angeles Times, and later senior vice president of CNN Digital. She is now running enterprises that are far lower profile outfits than that. And one in particular grew directly out of the COVID pandemic as it struck the New York City borough of Queens. It's called Epicenter NYC. She's co-founder and publisher of that newsletter and joins us now from Jackson Heights in Queens. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Robert.
Some people may recall stories a bit over a year ago about what was happening at the neighborhood public hospital in that part of Queens, Elmhurst Hospital. That really was the center of the pandemic. What is the mission, or was the mission at the beginning, of Epicenter NYC?
Sure. So I think it's worth noting at the time I worked at CNN, and some of CNN's news trucks were just blocks from my house here. And so indeed, we were dubbed the epicenter of the epicenter. The effort started quite organically, where our neighbors and community members were just turning to me and my husband saying, this bike mechanic, he didn't make it. The city has his body. He has no family in the US. How do we go about claiming the body so we can send the remains to his daughter? This shop in Jackson Heights is a Momo shop. It's a type of Nepali dumpling. They have half of their workers are undocumented. They don't know how to apply for loans. They feel like they have to shut down tomorrow. Is there any recourse for them? And so I share those anecdotes because I think for many of us in national journalism, they're exactly that. They're anecdotes, right? And we infuse our reporting with them. And then the trucks leave. This was probably the first time in my career where I said, I don't want to leave this story. I'm living this story. This feels like it's going to be with us for quite some time. And so I was still at CNN, and I just launched a newsletter saying, look, instead of emailing the same 50 people over and over for help, can we amplify the needs in our community? And then can we kind of connect with each other? Because if you'll remember, and I don't think I'm alone or we're alone here in Jackson Heights in feeling this way, but we did not see the government on the ground. Some of it is because, as Steve mentioned, it was just hard to go door to door. That's just not how we operated in the beginning days of the pandemic. But also there were decades of issues that surfaced once the lockdown began. And so we launched Epicenter NYC as a newsletter We're less than a year old, but we've now evolved into a pretty robust, powerful community news initiative. Our most recent effort allowed us to help more than 5,000 New Yorkers get vaccine appointments. As a result of that, we were contacted for people trying to navigate healthcare. There was a building that unfortunately was a victim of a 8-alarm fire. The people from that building asked us for help getting eyeglasses. And so, I mean, it's really become a community building exercise in a way that no job I've ever had in journalism has allowed me to do.
This project grew out of a crisis, out of one of the worst crises we've lived through, the pandemic. Absent a crisis, can it thrive, or is it always a crisis in Queens?
Well, there's always a crisis in Queens for sure, but there's always a crisis ever. I mean, if you think about the way we journalists operate, we gravitate towards crisis, right? I mean, this is hardly the first crisis I've ever covered in my 20+ year career. I've done earthquakes, I've done hurricanes, I've done crisis and tragedy. The difference, I think, and the pandemic forced this, is how we're reporting on it. And some of it, you might say, is because I'm so small, right? I mean, I live in the community. I have a few thousand people who are subscribed to us. But the other piece, which I think Steve was alluding to, is the nature of how we do our journalism has changed. And so data is one piece of it, but service and utility is very much another piece of this. And, you know, even when I was at CNN, as the pandemic struck, we were trying to figure out what can we tell people and how to live their lives every day. How will they live today, right? So I think that's the difference. My hope is that outlasts the pandemic, this idea of being in service to our communities. And as we talk about subscription models and community engagement, without that service to our communities, there is no value, there is no trust, and in some cases, there is no relevance.
In addition to Epicenter NYC, you've started something which it is part of, which is called URL Media, URL as in uplift, respect, and love, which describes itself as a network of Black and Brown community news outlets. Some people hear that sort of thing and say, identity politics, a fracturing of society. In your case, linking together news sources, not by what their audiences are, but what they're not. They're not white. Is that part of a trend that we should encourage, or we should be wary of?
Yeah. I think it's worth noting that the pandemic, of course, began, and smack in the middle of it, of course, we had the death of George Floyd. And as someone who's spent her career advocating for diversity in newsrooms, this really did feel different, the reaction to the death of George Floyd. And I think it's an ongoing reckoning, right? It's hardly over. And by some opinions, it's hardly just begun, right? I think the framework that you offer for me, and what other people think, you know, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, for me, it felt a necessary thing. My children are not white. I fear greatly a world and a news media that does not cover my children, my family as their own. And I think we just got to a stage last year. And as I left CNN, I'm elated that the mainstream media is waking up to the need for diverse coverage and the need to infuse community in how we do our jobs. But I also felt like it was worth taking outlets like mine. Epicenter is new, but the partners that URL Media has, we have 7 partners right now. Outlets like the Haitian Times and WURD, a Black radio station in Philadelphia, have been around for decades serving their communities in precisely the manner that does treat children like my own as their own in terms of coverage.
Mitra, Kalita, thanks. Hang around for further questions, and thanks for your contribution so far.
Thank you.
Our next 2 guests are both journalists who cover journalism. In a few minutes, we'll hear from Brian Stelter of CNN. First, a former colleague of mine, David Folkenflik. He is the media correspondent for NPR. And before he went to NPR, he spent 10 years reporting for the Baltimore Sun. He's also the author of the book Murdoch's World, The Last of the Old Media Empires. David, thanks for taking part in today's panel. And
Siegel, good to join you.
It's nice to be with you. First, the overarching question, how well or how poorly do you think the media fared in confronting both the pandemic and before that, the Trump presidency?
Well, I'd echo to a point what Steve Coll said earlier, the idea that I think in the final year, particularly of the Trump administration, which coincided with the first year of COVID, that the media stepped up. And I think it performed a public service with enterprise reporting. In terms of COVID, in some ways, I think it performed a public service by trying to do its best to report on the threat of the pandemic as it materialized kind of shimmeringly in front of our eyes and became ever more tangible and ever clearer about what would be likely to happen. They tried to marry not just the usual how are Washington power figures responding, which was a huge part of the story, but also what's the science, what's the public health, what can we learn from past incidents, what can we divine? And over time, you really saw journalists as, for example, happened in places like Miami or Charleston or South Carolina or other places after a hurricane, you saw people providing information in ways that in and of itself was valuable. Where can you get supplies? What should you really do? And let's be fair, a lot of the initial information based on public health officials, based on science, whatever, was not accurate, but the reporting didn't simply say it must be fixed and therefore it can never change. It said this is our best understanding at the time and it's a changing target and we're going to get there. I thought that in many ways, despite a lot of what we saw on cable news, there was a lot of solid, important, and public service-minded journalism that cost news organizations dearly. Even if we all saved on travel, they had to spend extraordinarily at a time where for many months the economy was down. Many advertisers, certainly advertising budgets were vaporized. In terms of the politics of Trump, I think you saw a discarding of the blinders or the shackles. The idea that fairness implies letting things go, that fairness implies not acknowledging the asymmetry of the moment, and particularly of the facts or of the assertions being made when it comes to our major parties at the moment. And you see that playing out within the Republican House caucus on Capitol Hill just, in the last 24 hours, with them shedding Liz Cheney, as conservative a figure as you could send from Wyoming, basically, to Congress, but nonetheless unwilling to deny the facts in front of her about the election and about the events of the January 6th insurrection. I think the media came to terms with, in some ways, its own disinclination to treat Trump purely on the merits of the facts and of the efficacy of his administration as opposed to the spectacle of it. And this past year, while there's been tremendous enterprise reporting throughout, this past year, I think you've seen a firmer grounding in what are we doing? What's the point? The point is to serve the public and to give them the information they need to evaluate their public officials.
Let me ask you a question, though. You spent, as I said, a decade at the Baltimore Sun, regional newspaper, famous heritage.
Great one.
That paper. A newspaper of that size in America today, what's its situation in terms of its survival, its success, its size?
Let's talk about the Sun itself.
Yeah.
The newspaper of H.L. Mencken, of Russell Baker, of David Simon, of Laura Lippman, and of many others, some of whhom are our colleagues at NPR. Mm-hmm. It's a paper that right now is up for sale with the rest of the chain. The shareholders have agreed in principle to sell it to a hedge fund called Alden Global Capital based in New York, a secretive hedge fund that has a record of just slashing to ribbons already damaged and depleted newspaper titles. Before it's even been transferred, it's already down to, call it, I believe it's about 80 some journalists in that newsroom when I was there. And I left in 2004, but when I was there at one point, there were over 400 journalists in that newsroom. So it is down to less than a fifth of the size that it was, the newsroom. And that just constricts its ambitions. It's won Pulitzers nonetheless. It's done great enterprise. It got a corrupt mayor tossed out a year or two ago. It did incredible reporting on Freddie Gray and the incidents that led to riots and protests there. But nonetheless, it is a greatly diminished enterprise from what it was. And, there are other papers that have fared far worse. So I think this is a time of real peril for local newspapers, regional newspapers, and as a result, a time of peril for our understanding of the communities we live in away from the great metropolitan centers like New York and Washington.
And what Mitra is doing, can that fill in some of the gaps created by shrinking local newspapers?
I think it is a complement to those newspapers that still exist. I don't think it can replace it, but I think it's incredibly important for these efforts, for some of the ones that Steve Coll mentioned, and for others to flourish, to serve both individual kind of communities, specifically targeted publications for particularly underserved communities, less wealthy communities, people of color, and others that have not necessarily been scrutinized or served well by major news outlets in cities across the country. But I think it's almost as though you need partnerships between organizations you consider natural competitors. And they can be reporting partnerships, but it's just a partnership, the idea of we need there to be enough critical mass of journalism in our communities and our regions and our states for there to be enough fresh reporting to hold people accountable and explain what's going on around us and to knit us together as a consequence. So it doesn't even require a form of collaboration for us to recognize the value in someone else saying, you know what, nobody's doing this on criminal justice here in Ohio. We're going to fill that in. You know what else? Latinos are not being served in Houston the way they need. We're going to take care of this. They're just time and again, you're going to have to see people step up and decide to both start and to sustain such organizations.
David Folkenflik of NPR, it's great to hear from you and to see you. And now batting cleanup, Brian Stelter, who hosts the CNN program Reliable Sources. And before becoming CNN's chief media correspondent, he was a media reporter at the New York Times. He is also the author of Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I didn't get to ask David Folkenflik about his Murdoch book, so I'll ask you about your Fox News and the Distorted Facts book. Fox News, Donald Trump, the Murdochs, Facts, Truth. Is that nexus central to American journalism today? And if so, where does it stand? What's happening?
Maybe not to journalism, but certainly to media. And I think that's the extra layer to add to what everyone has said so far. We live in an environment of parallel, competing universes of information. I would argue that the Fox-led world is much more fictional, much more fantastical and fear-based. Look at the coverage of President Biden's administration, and not just how negative it is on Fox, but how fearful and hateful and rage-filled it is. That is this alternative reality that is very, very popular within the United States, and it affects everything that all of us are doing, whether it's local journalism at the grassroots trying to help people get vaccines, or whether it's accountability coverage in a national newsroom trying to understand what Biden is actually doing. All of that is affected by this distortion that happens mostly from right-wing media, largely from Fox, and ultimately it is on the Murdochs. That's why David's book is so important. The stars on Fox are on there every day, but they are enabled and empowered by the Murdochs. And I think it creates a much more confusing, much more poisonous information environment than we lived in 10 or 20 or certainly 30 years ago.
Donald Trump challenged many sources of expertise, and his supporters loved him for doing it, whether it was the intelligence community or the generals, or in his last year in office, it was medical science after COVID-19 struck. How would you describe the way in which journalists dealt with a president who was so pugnacious in going after what seemed in many cases to be a pretty well-established fact? Did the American newsroom become more willing to say that's untrue, or on the one hand, but on the other hand?
I think it was a good thing that different newsrooms reacted to Trump very differently. CNN had a much more confrontational, call it out, call a lie model. The Associated Press or Reuters took a much more subdued approach while still providing fact checks, while still providing real information to counter his fake information. Look, obviously he tried to turn language upside down, calling real news fake, et cetera, et cetera. And I like that at CNN, we were empowered and still are today to call that out. I think especially on television, that's the way to connect to people on a one-to-one level through that first person voice. At the same time, though, we also need lots of fact checkers who are not trying to use their own voice, who are only trying to present the data so that you can decide for yourself what is true. So I think the bounty of responses to Trump is a good thing. The variety is a good thing. But the overall number one takeaway from the last 5 years is that the press is more adversarial, that it's awoken something in the national media that needs to remain, and I believe will remain. Yeah. I see it in coverage of Biden, and I see it in coverage of the GOP right now.
In reacting to that, do you think that in American journalism today, the lines between news story, news analysis, commentary, editorial commentary have moved in the direction of admitting more opinion than were admitted before?
I think on certain basic concepts and basic values, there are statements that we are making that, some people say are opinions. Standing up for democratic principles, believing in democracy, supporting voting rights, arguably everything, including a free press, is a statement of opinion. Defending the First Amendment is arguably a statement of opinion. If you want to get down to the root, down to the core here, but I think it's great that we're seeing many members of the media stand up for decency and democracy and those basic values. I think that's where the audience is, and we are standing on the side of the audience. Let me put it this way. If President Biden comes out and starts smearing the United States media, slandering the press as the enemy, et cetera, you're going to see the same, which of course he's not going to do, right? Because he knows better. But you would see the same response.
Cynics will say he won't do it because, as John McCain used to report, he used to look at the reporters and say, "This is my base." when he was on the road campaigning. I don't think
the White House press shop feels that way. I think the White House press shop feels that they're under quite a bit of scrutiny every day. But I take your point. I think the same response to Trump would happen to any other politician, politicians who behave in that hateful way, and that is. I think progress, but again, that adversarial approach is something that needs to stay in the DNA, and I believe it will.
I want to ask you about what strikes me as a very strange moment we're at, where there are many political liberals, typically supportive of press freedom, and many journalists who find themselves rooting for big defamation lawsuits over claims of election fraud brought by the election machine companies. And also supporting social media that shut out Donald Trump, whether it was Twitter rather clearly or Facebook in a much more muted fashion. Those are typically not actions that journalists identify with. That's the stuff that critics of journalism usually support. Well, what do you make of that fact?
I think you're identifying something that's very real. And on the defamation suit front, this is Fox being sued, other right-wing outlets being sued, Rudy, et cetera, for claims about the big lie, claims against Dominion and Smartmatic. So the way I separate this in my mind, because certainly defamation suits against newsrooms are a threat to newsrooms. Scurrilous, nonsense lawsuits are costing money in newsrooms that newsrooms can't afford. I think we need to draw a distinction between news operations that are trying to employ reporters versus propaganda or opinion operations that are employing entertainers, comedians, talk show hosts, propagandists. I think that's the line we need to draw. Obviously, that can be a debatable line. You could debate where that line starts and ends. But I think that's the key difference. When I worked on Hoax, my book about Fox, what kept coming up is that journalists at Fox are being squeezed, suffocated, pushed out. They don't feel there's room for them. They feel propaganda wins, news loses. Fox News does not have bureaus around the world. They don't have a bureau in China, so they weren't there on the ground when the pandemic started. They don't have the news infrastructure that NBC or ABC, for example, have. So I think we can start to distinguish between outlets in those ways. However, these defamation suits, I am very interested to see how they play out in that case. Now, I think on the social media case, what we're seeing are people pushing back against algorithms, seemingly they have control over our lives and our minds. There's this attempt to rebalance that relationship. And I do think journalists seem to be very much engaged in that fight and in that conversation. And but I agree with you on your perception that these are strange and unusual situations, and these stories are quite strange, it's quite odd in some cases. Yeah.
Yes. Brian Stelter, thanks so much. Hang in here now for questions. I want to hear from each of you, each of the four panelists we've heard from, just for a minute or two max before we get to questions that have been submitted. For Steve Coll, anything you've heard from our other three panelists that you'd like to remark on?
Well, they were all rich conversations, but I'll just pick up where you left off with Brian about the First Amendment and the press's attitude towards the controversy over President Trump's access to social media platforms and the like. What worries me is that, let's call liberalism, meaning liberalism in the classical sense of support for open societies and constitutions and democracy, not left-right American partisan politics. That liberalism right now is having trouble finding its voice, defending free speech, a free press in the face of the assaults on constitutional democracy by President Trump and his supporters. And I think that's a problem. I think that it's arguable that President Trump should be kept off of these platforms for violating their rules. We can have a whole nother hour or two of talking about that. But the arguments are often lacking a robust defense of the principles of free speech, even while making an argument that there should be an exception in this case. And I think the left has lost its voice in this country on free speech. And it worries me because it will have consequences. It'll have consequences in courtrooms. It'll have consequences in legislatures. And it's something that we should be worried about even beyond the kind of cases that generate headlines around Facebook and Twitter and the president's access to this platform.
I'm thinking back to when I was an editor at NPR, and a wonderful Chicago reporter, Scott Simon, went to Skokie, Illinois, to cover a march by the
Nazis.
The Nazis, the aggressive Nazis. I was wondering if it was the Ku Klux Klan, but it was an ACLU supported event. I mean, the idea was that even such an odious group had a right to speak. I can't imagine that today. I don't think. Mitra, Kalita, comments on what you've heard from you.
I'll pick up on something we're seeing in real time. So Donald Trump is not on Twitter, but neither are folks in India who are criticizing Narendra Modi or telling you the real deal when it comes to India's response to COVID right now. And there's kind of different pictures of that news story. Indians are getting one version, the rest of the world is getting another. And so I do think this thread of what's okay, what's not, are the platforms run as businesses, as distributors for our facts and information? It's not, while this is often presented through the lens of politics, I would say in the case of India and the situation with COVID, like again, to sort of come full circle of journalism after the pandemic. I mean, these are very real life or death decisions. You're seeing Twitter, for example, used to secure oxygen for people who are in the hospital. And if the Indian government doesn't want that picture of its health system in collapse presented to its own country, well, we are seeing another form of censorship that kind of is I think an outcome of Twitter being able to say what gets on and what doesn't, as well as countries being able to say what gets on and what doesn't. And then the last thing I'll just sort of react to is what Steve said at the beginning. And Steve knows I love him. I've worked with all three of these gentlemen in various parts of my career. But did the media pass the test? And I would say we didn't, because I feel like the way we covered the pandemic was through the lens of working from home and using words like quarantine and social distancing. And my hope is that journalism after the pandemic is actually covering what in some ways this pandemic, I don't know if there's an after, that much of the conditions that much of the country was operating within through the pandemic will outlast the pandemic. And so I guess I just have a hope that we kind of catch up to that reality, because I don't really believe that we have.
Okay, David Folkenflik, thoughts?
Well, to build on that, in some ways, you and I talked about for a few minutes the challenge of covering Trump, the challenge of covering COVID. In some ways, the last year presented us with 4 challenges, both of those. And in Trump's case, it's really, I think the press looked a little closer and said, this is more about covering sort of the Constitution and the nature of democracy itself that happens to be embodied in Trump and what he represents and what he's done. There's COVID. There was then, of course, the financial crisis, truly. And also, I think there was this great awakening, the idea of somehow this thing that we've been struggling with for decades, since the beginning of the American project, of course, about race and identity and class and who gets to take part in the American experiment, the American experience. But really, somehow over the past year, it became much more tangible. And it played out in American streets. It played out in classrooms. It played out, from my perspective, in Brian's, in newsrooms. And it forced journalists to think about how what frames, what prism through which they were scrutinizing and looking at the stories they sought to present. In fact, where they aimed the aperture in the first place, what was in the range of vision? Could they get depth perception and peripheral vision at the same time somehow? And I think that was a challenge that, I think in moments of crisis, news organizations often rise to it. I do think that it's when the crisis, the sense of urgency and immediacy recedes, that's the challenge for journalism. Do they get to be embracing the mission at the moment at which the stakes are at the very highest, or if they subside just a bit, can we still hold on to that notion of why it is we got into business in the first place?
Okay, David, thank you. And Brian Stelter, last thoughts?
The pandemic was almost too big, is almost too big to cover, 10 different massive simultaneous events happening to different kinds of people in different places. And to Mitra's point, a lot of the coverage was oriented toward folks that were able to work from home and not toward the folks that kept the country alive and functioning. I hope that one of the takeaways after the pandemic is we need to provide more 101, the basics, always the basics. I think if we polled the country right now, we'd find most Americans have faulty understanding of outdoor mask mandates and of outdoor transmission. There was, as David said, so much information that we were told early on that was untrue. And those were good faith errors and good faith understandings, as well as some bad faith behavior by the Trump administration. But if I would to go onto Google right now and just try to find the basics about the safety of outdoor transmission of the virus, it would actually still be pretty hard to find just the very, very basic story that I want to send my mom to give her reassurance. And I think we are always so caught up in the day-to-day, the minute by minute, the lead of the story on the broadcast, that we're still not providing enough of those basic stories. Mitra was always pushing us to that at CNN. I've been trying to push in my small way as well. We can have those daily wins where you get that 101 story online, but we need journalists to have more of that 101 mentality to help people connect to journalism where they are and not where I am. I'm a news junkie,
right.
And there's lots of stories written for me, but not enough for others.
Thank you. I was always a big booster of definitional stories. What does this mean?
Yeah.
Well, we have questions coming in from people who are watching us. So this is for Steve Coll from Paul Wrights, who asks, is the press giving the September withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan the attention it deserves? And in general, how well is the press helping shape a proper perspective of American presence, I assume, in Afghanistan?
Well, the New York Times is investing heavily in coverage of Afghanistan as the withdrawal approaches. So there will be at least one news outlet that will document what unfolds, which is unpredictable. But in general, the presence of the American and European press in Afghanistan has diminished greatly since the troop presence diminished circa 2012. There's only a handful of bureaus left in Kabul. A lot of folks aren't there permanently outside of the wires and the Times. And it's a very, very difficult story to cover, even absent COVID, because much of the country is not safe for international journalists, and the Taliban don't have much of a press operation or press office that allows folks to travel to the front lines or to conflict zones. I think from the American perspective, the events that unfold in Kabul and the major cities where journalists can be present, though at some risk, will be a remarkable chapter in a tragic story of American expenditure of lives and resources over the last 10 or 15 years. And I certainly hope that more newsrooms decide to go ahead and bear the expense and try to manage the risk of covering that story, because it is something that many Americans sacrificed lives or limbs or months or years of their own service, and they deserve a window into what happens now.
Thank you. This is a question from Helene G. I'm going to direct it to, whoever wants to raise a hand to want to answer it can. Helene says, I cannot be as optimistic as the panelists. 75 million plus people believe that alternate facts is a real concept. She's speaking of the vote for Donald Trump. I'll add to that question. To what extent, David Folkenflik, since you've looked up, to what extent should the newsroom be mindful of what, as Steve just mentioned, what the polls say, what people believe, and how should that direct the treatment of stories?
Well, let me say a couple things. First, 75 million Americans did vote for Donald Trump and had every right to do so. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean 75 million Americans actually believe that the election was stolen. A high proportion of Republicans did, but Trump won some independents and Democrats too, who are much less inclined to believe that. You're seeing the polarization of beliefs as well as the polarization in terms of other kinds of policy adherence. I would say that the newsrooms should be mindful of that, but I don't think that means discarding their commitment to presenting the truth. I think that means they have to present evidence and not be contemptuous or dismissive of those who may hold those beliefs, even if they can be sharply critical or tough-minded on those who would propagate that BS. I mean, to be frank, it seems to me that news organization, one of the things that's great about public radio and NPR is that it can be very tough-minded. And we're reminded in this 50th anniversary season for NPR of how a lot of the toughest minded folks of NPR have been its founding mothers and their successors. But NPR at its best can do that, and at the same time reflect people in ways that they recognize themselves and people from their communities and their points of views, and recognize their voices and hear them actually getting the time to unpack their beliefs. That doesn't mean we have to equate those positions. That doesn't mean you have to affirm falsities. I think quite the opposite, but I think we can be respectful of the people, of all citizens equally.
But, when we spoke recently, I mentioned to you that a great regret I had when I retired was thinking back on the birther story. I felt that we at NPR, at least at All Things Considered, had typically said, well, this is a nuts story. This is crazy stuff. And why should we give any airtime to this idea, which has no facts behind it? By the time I retired 1 year into the last presidency, I felt like we should have done a 3-part series on this crazy belief that people had, and we should have grappled with it. But of course, the person who probably would have been called upon to do that story would have been you.
Sure. Well,
as the media coverage, would you have? I mean, and of course, the realistic question is, can you have a newsroom that's half playing defense against stupid ideas, while the other half actually does real journalism about things that are true?
I see it a slightly different way. And you and I did talk about that. I think the birther issue is a very good example. I also think just before I joined NPR in 2004, the Swift boat question of John Kerry. And I don't think this is partisan, but I think that the way in which there is an asymmetry in the way in which falsity gets woven in at the moment to the Republican narrative. At that time, my newsroom and others were saying, look, these things being said about John Kerry are untrue. They were disproven. Actually, they were disproven by the Boston Globe in 1999 when these things first burbled up. We don't have to address that. And meanwhile, on Fox News, but particularly talk radio and this sort of small network of conservative blogs in 2004, really took hold. And by August of 2004, after the conventions, this was sort of a crisis thing for John Kerry to deal with as we got to September. And I was reporting on it, not to play defense with the facts, but this was a roiling marriage of media and political figures with an agenda and violating our understanding of the truth. And I think it's absolutely the right thing for major news organizations. What Andrew Morstead, then of ABC News, to go upstream in the Mekong Delta to a little town where the firefight occurred and interview villagers who had never seen television, had no idea who John Kerry was, but knew all about that battle to find out what the facts were. The AP and Anderson Cooper, if I'm remembering correctly, going to Indonesia to determine what the madrasa that Barack Obama went to was like and saying, these are the facts. I think that's always a value. And I don't think we have to be apologetic for that or defensive about it. We should stand tall. We should have broad shoulders and we should be proud about doing it.
Let me just add to that. Then what we need is for consumers to appreciate that work, that expensive work. And that's fundamentally a news literacy, media literacy challenge to distinguish between a newsroom that spent $20,000 to get to the bottom of that lie versus a talk show propagandist who makes you feel good at night on Fox, who makes you feel really good and tells you who to hate. And we have to help people distinguish between those, which goes back to something so much deeper than just labels on screen. It comes down to, person to person conversations, trying to help people understand the difference between news and entertainment.
I have a question that was submitted, pre-submitted. I'll give it to Mitra. This listener writes, while I have always subscribed to newspapers and magazines, what is different for the generation of younger adults who get their news off cell phones and social media?
Well, I'm glad we're talking about younger adults because I think that's the coming change for sure. Within newsrooms and externally is many of these changes will be forced upon us. I think some of it is what we've been discussing here of social platforms. Chances are if you're consuming news on your phone, you're getting it through a Facebook, a Twitter, Apple News, you're typing it into a Google search engine. And so just to kind of put a bow on what we've just been talking about, think about what happens, Robert, by not doing the birther story. What remains in your Google search results are other people like Tucker Carlson or other folks who have been engaging in this story, and they kind of populate the results. And so I think one thing just for mobile journalism for folks to think about is that it's a battle to get onto people's phones through those platforms. And so we curse them, but we also need them pretty fundamentally, not just to spread the word and get our web traffic, but also, I don't think it's lofty to say is kind of an underpinning of democracy. You want to do those stories because you want them to surface.
Although, you reminded me when we spoke before this panel of people whom you are writing for in Queens who don't have Twitter accounts, they don't go on Facebook, they're not wired into social media. Yes, I think all of us talking here right now probably learn the news first on our phones, if not our watches at this point. Yeah. But that can't describe 2/3 of the people in the United States.
You're absolutely right. And so just to give you a real concrete example, one thing we did during our vaccine efforts is we were helping a number of restaurant workers. Restaurant workers are not on Twitter. They might be on Facebook, but they often work 2 or 3 jobs. They don't have the time to figure all this out. And so we actually created a Google folder with letters they could download and show up at a vaccine site, and I am who I am. And so I think some of the use both of technology as well as our journalism is, does the information necessarily need to be in an article format or in, a bite-sized video? It might actually just be empowering somebody with the actual letter they need to get the service that they're looking for. So yes, you're absolutely right on that.
What may be our last question, I think, and I'll put it to Steve Coll, somebody submitted this. How do you and should you prevent the inherent bias of billionaire newspaper and network owners like Murdoch and Bezos in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, et cetera?
I don't think as citizens, there's much you can do to prevent it, but I think to Brian's kind of reference to media literacy, everybody who's a citizen who wants to consume journalism, who's worried about our democracy and who believes in journalism's place in it, I think has a duty to be a more active news consumer than they had to be 20 or 30 years ago. I do think that means paying for news. You can choose what you want to pay for, but newsrooms now require their readers to fund their operations, whether it's philanthropically or commercially by buying subscriptions. And I think we all have to develop a media diet that's varied and skeptical. Even those of us who are in the business, I think many of us probably read across kind of ideological ownership just to double check and make sure we're not missing things in our side view mirrors in terms of people's assumptions that they bring to important stories. So look, this is a time of struggle in our democracy. Journalism is a part of that struggle, and citizens like the ones who I think are listening today who want to be active participants are going to have to be more active consumers, more purposeful consumers of news than we were all maybe in 20 or 30 years ago.
By the way, you remind me that as an elementary school student and later a junior high schooler in New York City, I was taught how to read a newspaper. But it could only be the New York Times or the Herald Tribune. There was no place for the New York Post and it was a very different outlook to the New York Post then, or the Daily News. And it always occurs to me, I don't know if you could get that through a school board nowadays. I don't know if that would be too controversial to limit what a good newspaper is. Brian, do you think that's a bygone era?
I wish we could find a way to teach that, though. We're going to have to. I mean, unfortunately, the advice we always come back to is the basic advice. There's a reason why these brands have been around for 100 years or 50 years for NPR, because at least they try to get it right. The great dividing line in media today is between those who try and those who don't give a damn. And there's a lot on that side, partisan websites and rage-filled websites that just want to make you feel better, or in some cases make you feel worse. But we have to defend the ones on the good side of the line that are at least trying to get it right. And as Steve said, that's through our subscriptions. It's with our dollars. I proudly pay for the Baltimore Sun because I grew up in Maryland and I want to make sure it doesn't go down without a fight. All of the brands that you as a customer have a vested interest in, we have to try to help survive by subscribing.
I might still pay for the Herald Tribune if I could, but I can't do it. Brian Stelter, David Folkenflik, Mitra, Kalita, and Dean Steve Coll, thank you all for taking part in this discussion and for being so enlightening and interesting about it. Thanks to you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We have one more thing to do here. Since we began these panels almost a year ago, we have checked in often with Dr. Michael Drescher, who's head of the emergency department at Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva. The subject has been and remains COVID. When we started out, we didn't know that Israel would set the benchmark for controlling the virus. These days, there are some terrible things happening in and around Israel that are worse than COVID. So here's the bad news first. First, we had the catastrophe on the holiday of Lag BaOmer when a multitude at a religious festival were crushed and more than 40 people died. Now an outbreak of deadly violence between Palestinians and Israelis over Jerusalem, exchanges of rocket fire and airstrikes between Israel and Gaza. Those are matters for other panels, for other programs to do. We turn to Michael Drescher now, amazingly, about COVID for the good news. Mike Drescher, thanks for joining us once again. And tell us, what are the numbers? How many cases, how many deaths, how many people vaccinated in Israel?
Well, hi, Robert, and it's great to be back, and thank you. Well, really, it's a shame that we didn't have a few days or weeks to kind of bask in the success of the COVID story here, but we really are seeing what I think is the end of the. You never want to be too sure because there could be some new variant, but as of right now, there's only 825 people with COVID in the country. Very few tens of people, 35 people were diagnosed with the illness over the past day or so, and about over 5 million people have been vaccinated out of the 9 million people. 2 million of those being children, so they're not even in the calculation. So really, people over 40, probably 80% of the people have been vaccinated. So really, it's quite a success, and the hospitals have closed down the COVID wards by and large, including the Rabin Medical Center. So it's not that we're seeing zero, but it's close enough that we really think that we're seeing the better than the light at the end of the tunnel. We're kind of coming out of the tunnel. And
how much of the country has reopened?
By and large, I would say most. People right now, there's a problem with gatherings because of the other events that you mentioned with the rocket fire from Gaza. There's going to be some areas that people can't gather, but there have been already sporting events with 30,000 people, which been made. Now in Israel, there is the vaccine passport has been institutionalized, and so you need to have either that or a negative test to get into some of these things. But once having had that, really things are quite open: restaurants, bars, beaches, etc.
Any restrictions left on daily life?
Well, you do. There is still a mask requirement indoors or at large public gatherings, but outside, walking around the city or by yourself, certainly that's been removed as well. But that's really probably the only one. And then international travel still is not back to anything near the pre-COVID kind of ease and convenience. But those really, I think, are the main things. Otherwise, really, you look around, you see that things are getting much more back to normal.
And you mentioned children. Are Israeli health officials confident that the vaccines are safe for children? And are there plans to vaccinate school children before the next year?
Yes, and this is a big topic of discussion, mostly because our risk-benefit kind of a thing. First of all, there's the kind of the statutory process, and people are waiting for the FDA to come through with their final recommendation regarding the safety for children. But the question is this going to be good for children, or is this going to be good for the society in terms of the herd immunity kind of situation? Children don't get as sick by and large, but it's not that children don't get sick at all. And so a case can be made and will be made that people should vaccinate their kids for the sake of their kids and not just for the sake of kind of epidemiology. That is a big discussion that's ongoing right now.
And this must be a tough time for you. I mean, given that the rocket attacks out of Gaza are aimed at central Israel and toward the area where, the greater Tel Aviv area where you are,
Yeah.
Is the emergency department at Rabin, is it preparing for possible mass injuries or worse?
Yeah, certainly. Well, at the Rabin Medical Center, our emergency department, which is relatively new, was built so that it's already, we do not have to move when there's a rocket attack because our building is considered it's considered secure against explosions. So that's really a huge benefit because some of the other departments upstairs still do have to reorganize. We are, of course, on a daily basis reviewing our procedures and drills for mass casualties in case, God forbid, a missile should fall in Petah Tikva like they've fallen in Ashdod and in Ashkelon. And, here in Ra'anana, where I am, we heard explosions last night. So it's not far away, and we are certainly making ourselves prepared, and the Rabin Medical Center is doing its part to fortify, give people a sense of security and be a sense of, be a part of the safety net during this really difficult time.
Well, here's hoping that things de-escalate soon and that you don't have to go to emergency operations there. Mike Drescher, thanks a lot for talking with us once again.
Thank you, Robert, and I really appreciate the AFRMC and for this great program.
Mike Drescher is head of the emergency department at Rabin Medical Center. And our thanks once again to our media guests, Dean Steve Coll, Mitra, Kalita, David Folkenflik, and Brian Stelter. Many thanks to Joshua Plout, Nate Bonzani, and Roni Giuliano of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, and our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Our program sponsor, the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, is a 501c3 national charitable organization. It represents in the U.S. Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. The website is www.afrmc.org. Join us next month for Will New York Bounce Back, or the city's COVID symptoms there for the long haul? Special guests will include Scott Reckler, chairman and CEO of RXR Realty, and Ben Brantley, former chief theater critic of the New York Times. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Abnormal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.